ready to keep you company wherever you are. Carte Blanche, the podcast, brings you immersive, hard-hitting stories anytime, anywhere, every week.
Welcome to another episode of the WholeWeek Wrap with Daily Maverick and Carte Blanche. With us this week is Daily Maverick journalist Nonkululeko Njilo. Here's what's coming your way. An organization being torn apart from the inside. What the conflict between two ANC heavyweights reveals about the party.
It's not just about them having bad blood, it's about the political direction of the party. So the conflict is not going to go away, to be quite honest with you. Instead, it's going to escalate.
Then, another fail for former public protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane. Later, the US hurricanes serve as a sobering preview of things to come. And a minister on a mission. Gayton McKenzie delivers on his promises. But first, now that the city of Tshwane has a new mayor at the helm, two coalition role players are pulling in two very different directions. On the one hand, we have the DA making demands, give us back our mayor or else. And on the other, the EFF is showing us its mature side and calling for stability. All this while the battle for Ekurhuleni heats up. Hi, Nonkululeko. Welcome back to the show. How have you been?
Thank you for having me. I have been great. How have you been?
I've been good. I've been loving summer, and we'll get into weather-related matters a little bit later. But yeah, I've been fantastic. Now, I know you've been all over the show in the last couple of weeks with regards to the Gauteng political scene. Let's first chat about the new Tshwane Mayor, Action SA's Nasipi Moya. Now, her appointment comes after a successful motion of no confidence against previous city mayor Cille Brink. And I want you to firstly tell us just a little bit more about Moya, because I'm sure many of our listeners don't really know much about her.
So Dr. Nasipi Moya was the first deputy executive mayor that was elected in January this year. So a lot of people were quite confident when she took up that position because there was an assumption that she would assist in holding the DA accountable, which was obviously in charge at the time. So she is quite knowledgeable and experienced. Prior to that position, she had been a chief of staff in one of the executive mayors in that city. She's got a PhD in political science. She's got a master's in philosophy, and she's done a lot of work in the governance space. I think her thesis is also around that. So she's quite a knowledgeable somebody. As you correctly pointed out, she was elected into the position following the successful motion of no confidence against Cille Brink, which was spearheaded by the ANC for many reasons, some of which include the lack of service delivery in the less affluent areas, the likes of Soshanguve, Hammanskraal, Atteridgeville, which, the ANC claims had limited to no services compared to the more affluent areas in Tshwane. So, as you would know, that the ANC has got a coalition framework which stipulates that a party with the majority of the seat in any council should take up the mayoral position. So in this case, they did not have it their way because Action SA was simply not begging down, saying we've got a credible candidate with the experience, someone who's been there, someone who's capable not only of stabilizing the city, but continuing with the good work that was already taking place. We did see the ANC admitting to say, hey, look, we tried to get our way, but we failed. We were persuaded by Action SA to go with this candidate. But I think we are likely to see the deputy executive mayor come from the ANC, and obviously the ANC occupying some critical position in the mayoral committee that is going to be assembled in the next coming days or weeks.
Let's talk a bit about reactions following Moya's appointment. I understand that the DA is definitely not happy. They've said that they want Cille Brink back. Helen Zille has been at the forefront of this call to have Brink reinstated. And she's made it very clear that should Brink not be brought back, the DA will possibly pull out of other coalition agreements in other metros. Now, the ANC has said that Helen Zille's recent demands regarding Brink has been divisive, and they've called her tactics, quote, a significant obstacle to having a functioning coalition government. And I really think A lot of people would probably agree with this because it does seem as though the DA is placing party politics above all else in this matter.
I'm one of those people who would agree because first things first, there is not a single party that got the majority in Tshwane like the other hang municipalities or metros. So then what needs to happen is they all need to be able to be in a position where they can reach compromise. You simply cannot have any sort of arrogance because they are all struggling. So I think they should have really sat down, sorted out their differences and compromised, really, because you cannot come out and say it's either Celia Brink or nothing. You should be able to say, okay, if we can't get this, can we at least get this? So we have seen a lot of arrogance coming from the DA.
And the EFF, of course, welcomed Moya's mayorship. I mean, they supported her being voted in. And on Thursday, EFF leader Julius Malema said that, as you've stated as well, is that Moya's appointment will hopefully result in more fair access to basic services in various areas that are less affluent. As you've said, Mamelodi, Hammanskraal, Atteridgeville, Ga-Rankuwa, Soshanguve. But the party also believes that Moya will bring political stability to Tshwane. What is the reasoning the EFF has given for their support for Moya, aside from the service delivery aspect, of course?
So we had a brief conversation on the sidelines of the council meeting with the EFF Gauteng chairperson, Kululeko Dunga. But I thought it was very interesting to hear that part of the reasoning for supporting Moya was that there are talks for further configuration of metros. And what that looks like is the EFF taking over the Ekurhuleni Council. So I thought that was also even more interesting because the very same Kululeko Dunga was an MMC for finance in Ekurhuleni and was in charge of the budget, which is about 50 billion rand or so, but he was fired. And I think at the time of his axing, the mayor said it was due to unforeseen misalignments. So I don't see how this configuration is going to work because they've obviously had fallouts. And to be quite honest with you, there were a lot of accusations against the EFF and their ability to run such a big metro. So I think we are yet to see how that will pan out. There was an attempt to ask the EFF leader, Julius Malema, last week about whether or not he supports this idea. And in fact, he did confirm that they are all for Johannesburg having an ANC mayor, Tshwane having an Action SA mayor, as well as Ekurhuleni having an EFF mayor.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of back and forth around the Ekurhuleni matter as well. I mean, the EFF says that the ANC made promises and then they backed out of that. So we're going to have to see what happens there. Just to kind of wrap up this conversation around power sharing and coalition dealings, I think a number of people are likely quite surprised by the very mature position the EFF has taken in all of these coalition dealings. In fact, Malema threw some shade at the DA during last week's press conference, basically stating that even if the EFF doesn't get what it wants out of these deals, it won't throw its toys out of the cot.
No, it was indeed very interesting. They've shown a lot of political maturity throughout these coalition negotiations, except obviously during the course of the formation of the GNU in Parliament, which is, a conversation for another day. But I do agree that they've shown a lot of political maturity and that part of the reason the EFF has sort of matured around coalition talks is because we are 18 months away from the local government elections. And they can't afford to flip-flop. They've got to focus on their campaigns.
All is not well within the ANC. At least that seems to be the case when looking at the recent tussle between ANC Secretary General Fikile Mbalula and Gauteng ANC leader Panyaza Lesufi. The standoff comes after Lesufi made a number of remarks relating to the DA's Helen Zille, coalition agreements and the GNU. In a letter, Mbalula demanded his colleague appear before the ANC's top 7 at Luthuli House, an attempt to institute disciplinary proceedings against Lesufi. However, Mbalula's attempts failed and, in the process, revealed far more about the ANC than the party would have liked. Keeping with political matters, let's talk about the ANC for a bit. This past week, we saw clear signs of a split within the ANC when Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi made a number of public comments criticizing the DA for its, quote, birthright mentality unquote, when it comes to national coalition government. The ANC was very quick to call Panyaza to order. We know Fikile Mbalula wanted to call him before committee. They said there's nothing wrong, everything's fine. So what's really going on within the ANC, and more specifically between Lesofie and Mbalula?
Look, there's definitely a lot of tensions and obviously bad blood between Lesofie, who is the chairperson of Gauteng, which is really one of the critical provinces for the party, and I think in South Africa in general. And obviously Fikile Mbalula, who is the Secretary General of that party, which is considered to be the engine of the party. So I think both of them have like a strategic interest in the direction of the ANC. So I've heard some people say that Mbalula is sort of positioning himself to take over from Ramaphosa, which already tells you that it's sort of a succession battle. But I also think Panyaza seems to think, having crossed swords with Mbalula in public, he might descend to the NEC, which is like the highest decision-making body of the ANC. So I think it's not just about them having bad blood, it's about the political direction of the party. So the conflict is not going to go away, to be quite honest with you. Instead, it's going to escalate because these are fundamental differences. You've got Mbalula, who is the engine of the party, saying, working with the DA is strategic. And you've got a Panyaza who says, actually, it is a betrayal of what the ANC stands for. So it's quite difficult times. And I think in terms of what it means or where does it leave the ANC, I think it breaks down the party and gives rooms for further factions, if I may put it that way. Because what happens after Ramaphosa? This is a question some people are grappling with. And there seems to be a suggestion that the situation is just going to worsen. So it's quite, difficult times for the party.
Yeah, because people within the ANC are definitely vying for the presidential position of the ANC. So I suspect we might be in for a very dramatic ANC National Conference this December.
No, there's a lot we are going to see. So definitely it'll not be boring.
Another loss for former Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane. This after she tried to force the Public Protector's Office to pay a 10 million rand gratuity she feels entitled to. However, the Supreme Court of Appeal disagreed, calling her application absurd and questioning why a labour dispute was being heard by the court in the first place. But somehow we suspect the latest defeat won't dissuade Mkhwebane from approaching the courts again. Another matter you've been following closely is the various legal cases involving former Public Protector Busisiwe Mkhwebane. It feels like she's in court non-stop since her impeachment in September last year. Talk us through her most recent court battle and subsequent defeat, because, the list is just getting longer.
It is getting longer and longer, and it's quite exhausting, if you ask me.
Yes.
So, the case I was covering was just around her challenging her employer's refusal to pay her gratuity of 10 million rands, which has been paid to all previous public protectors. So basically, the issue there, Mkhwebane was basically arguing that she is entitled to the 10 million gratuity, which has obviously been given to her predecessors, but the Office of the Public Protector was saying, no, you are not entitled because you did not leave, out of your own volition. You were basically fired for incompetence and misconduct. So I remember the Office of the Public Protector, in defending itself, used advocate Tembeka Ngaitobi, who said giving her this gratuity would kind of set a bad precedent in a way that it's going to look like you are rewarding incompetence. We also had advocate Dali Mbofu arguing that it's a violation of her rights. She is entitled to this money, and obviously advancing the argument that everyone else has gotten it and saying it would be unjust, kind of painting Mkhwebane as a victim in all this.
Following the latest ruling against her, Mkhwebane took to X, which she's done numerous times before, and she said that the judicial system has been, quote, weaponized to financially burden and corner her, unquote. And then she also criticized what she calls, quote, the repeated legal and financial pressures directed at me, unquote. I'm a bit confused here because She's brought most of these frivolous cases before court. So how is she the victim here? And I'm also trying to understand what her end game is, because I'm not quite sure what she's trying to achieve at this point.
Look, I was not surprised by the remarks she made on Twitter at all, because she's been consistent in attacking whether the judicial system or the Office of the Public Protector or her predecessor, Koleka Kalega. In fact, part of the judgment from Judge Moki was that some of the attacks that she launched against Kalega, as well as the Office of Public Protector, as well as the National Assembly, were not, justified. There was no reason at all. But I mean, speaking about her end game, I honestly do not know what her end game is, and I don't think anyone seems to know. But the reality is, every South African is entitled or has an opportunity to go to court and lodge a dispute in whatever they believe is unjust. So I think she's just using all the legal avenues available to her to sort of continue viewing herself as this victim. I don't know, really.
Following 2 devastating hurricanes in a single week, several areas along the Gulf Coast, including Florida's west coast, are now picking up the pieces and counting the costs. This past Saturday, authorities confirmed at least 17 deaths as a result of Hurricane Milton, while Hurricane Helene resulted in at least 230 deaths. How many people are still missing is unclear, but authorities believe it could be in the thousands. Meanwhile, climate experts have issued a sobering warning. Things are only going to get more extreme. Let's turn our attention to the weather. And we've had some great weather in Joburg lately, but the same can't be said really for other parts of the world. Of course, we've seen hurricanes Milton and Helene wreaking havoc across several US states. Firstly, I want to know, have you been following the storm reports, whether it's on the news or online? Have you kind of been storm watching like some of us have?
I think we all have been, because I think one way or the other, we are likely to affect it at some point. So I have been watching, not necessarily closely, but I have been paying some level of attention.
Now, for me, I just want to say this firstly. I found it utterly crazy to see people on TikTok really hunkering down by choice in mandatory evacuation zones in Florida. It's just pure madness. I mean, there's a guy who was floating around in his house in a little kayak. So I admittedly was more invested in what the TikTok influencers were doing during the storm. Many of them literally live streaming their experiences throughout it all. But on a more serious note, scientists have warned that globally we're in for some really dramatic weather events in the next year or so, with oceans getting warmer, storms are getting stronger, and that invariably leads to really insane flooding in parts of the world where we haven't seen it in a very, very long time. In recent weeks, we've seen flooding in the Sahara Desert. England is having issues with their second worst harvest on record due to wet weather. So, yeah, things are just really not looking very good.
Yeah, I thought, the England case was particularly interesting and saddening, to be quite honest. And I know a lot of industries are affected. And because I love my wine, I obviously did see the developments around that. Farmers are losing billions of rands as a result of that. I saw a report on how the cold and wet summer has led to mold and diseases in some of the wine, meaning they've had to harvest much smaller amount of wine that is obviously going to be sold.
And then in terms of just what all of this means for South Africa, researchers and meteorologists have already said we're in for a much warmer, far wetter summer. So increased flooding across various parts of the country. Some researchers have pointed at the realities of El Nino conditions hitting us this year.
We've experienced the phenomenon before, but I think just reading up gave me a bit of anxiety because, for instance, it's likely to affect not only ordinary South Africans, but mostly farmers or the agricultural space. For instance, in terms of maize, which is a staple food in many South African households, it is very vulnerable to water stress. So, this can lead to increase in food prices. And I think this phenomenon at large is going to make it very difficult for farmers, forcing them to make difficult decisions in terms of water allocation. It's going to affect livestock as well, in a sense that if there's little water, it means there's poor nutrition. it means their health of the animals is compromised. And obviously, it could lead to increased mortality. So it's going to place not only us, but farmers as well in a tighter position.
In July, shortly after taking over as Minister of Sport, Arts and Culture, Gayton McKenzie said his department will no longer be a ministry that will be content with congratulating artists and creatives only. Well, it seems he's keeping his promise. Just last week, he showed his support for local musician Carte after she criticized South African music fans for failing to support local talent. This after tickets for an upcoming Chris Brown show sold out in a matter of hours. So, could we finally see artists and athletes across the country getting the support from government they've been begging for years? Let's wrap things up with a quick look at Gayton McKenzie. We've spoken about him a few times on this show purely because of his very positive, very public approach to governance, and he's certainly delivering on promises, it seems. First off, his promise to make spinning a legit sport is becoming a reality, it seems. And then he's also considering ways to bring Formula One back into the country, which I don't know, there's a lot of money required to make that happen, so I don't really see that happening anytime soon. But then he also reminded us of the importance of supporting local artists in South Africa, specifically in relation to the whole Chris Brown Carte issue that kind of crept up this past week. Have you been following this story?
I have been following Gayton McKenzie, and surprisingly, he's making headlines for all the right reasons. And he seems to be making good on his promises, to be quite honest with you. And just on your remarks around Formula One, I mean, it's one of those big promises, and the reality is it would cost millions of rands and probably hundreds. But I think the return on investment might be impressive. So crossing fingers for that. And I think I was particularly impressed when he made remarks around Formula One being an international competition, yet it's missing one continent, which is Africa. But it is an opportunity for South Africa to showcase its talent on a global stage. So I think I'm watching that with hawk's eyes, and I see there's been a lot of meetings around that. And for some reason, I'm quite optimistic. And then regarding Carte, we saw Carte, taking to social media, just expressing dissatisfaction with the lack of support that local artists sometimes experience. And we saw our minister then just coming through saying, actually, I will attend that concert. In fact, I will even purchase 200 tickets for those who wish to attend as well. So I think he's literally just walking the talk. And I think he's made a whole lot more promises. I remember in August, myself and Rebecca Davies, my colleague, wrote a story about some of the promises he'd made. And I remember one of them was around pledging his salary to the Jocelyn Foundation, as well as other organizations. We took it upon ourselves to sort of fact check whether or not he'd done this. And to my surprise, he had. And it was so heartwarming to speak to some of the founders of these organizations saying, yes, this man has indeed delivered on his promise, and he's given us 50,000 rands, and it's making a whole lot of difference. I remember this one case in Kagiso. This man runs an art gallery, but they also run like a feeding scheme and a whole lot of other programs, basically just taking children off the street. And this man was saying, actually, it's made a lot of difference because I'm able to feed more kids. I'm able to accommodate more kids, which I thought was really heartwarming to see and refreshing, because it's very common for politicians to make promises and not deliver on those.
No, definitely. It's great to see leadership in action and him being on the ground and doing his thing and really committing to his role as minister. So it's fantastic to see. But that brings us to the end of this week's show. Thanks again so much for joining us. It's been great chatting to you and having you back on the show. It's been a good while. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. Catch us again next week for another Whole Week Wrap. Until then, why not join the conversation on Twitter, Facebook, and everywhere else? We always love hearing from you.